Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing very well. We have an amazing group of panelists here today, and it's again one of those big shout outs we have to give to everyone, especially all our business councils. As you can see, there's a poster behind me and it shows all the business councils that took place. I'll be leaning back so afterwards you can actually see them properly. It once again shows how we all work together to create things that are very useful and also timely. This is an unprecedented time, and this is the time to give back. So first of all, I also want to thank everybody from the Canadian Business Council. We've got Sangeeta and Heba. They are amazing. They're usually the people in the background, and that doesn't mean that they're not working. They're working like crazy to make sure that we all get online. I want to thank you all also that you're being safe. I want you to take care of yourselves. We'll have a quick poll going up just to make sure that everyone is, we know how you're doing today. It's just 1-2 question poll, nothing very difficult. And then I'm going to go straight to Ayanda. Ayanda is going to be, I want to say that she's going to be other than what she is, which is amazing. And by the way, all our panelists are amazing. Isn't that right, Nicholas? I hope he's listening in the background.
Absolutely listening, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So she's going to be actually, other than the moderator, she is going to be the hostess with the mostest. She's going to make sure that everything is running smoothly. Your questions can be put in the chat box. So we're going to do the Q&A right at the very end. If you could see the poll, and even the panelists, if you just want to take a quick, it's just a quick little icebreaker. We just want to know how you're doing today. Okay, we want to know what vibe is going on, so that way we make sure that we are directing our questions and answers correctly. As you can see, so please all you take a moment to answer them. So Heba, can you just put up the poll for a second? I think we're all done, like with 3 questions. I think we've got it. Oh, this is amazing. Do you know that every time we do a webinar, the numbers that I'm doing well is going up? So I'm happy to hear that. This is the curve that we want. And then how many of you are Canadians and how many are others? The other is the right actual number, because as true Canadians, or all our business councils, we are others. We are sometimes a lovely mix. These are very important, these webinars for you. We'll be more than happy that when we're going to be sending out the video, the link to the YouTube channel, we'll also be sending out some information about our business councils and how you can be part of them. I think this is where I can kindly step back and give you the mic. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Diana. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you from whichever part of the world you're joining us. Welcome, esteemed members and friends of the Canadian Business Council. I'm Ayanda Moropani, your moderator for today, all the way from the beautiful and sunny city of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Well, such unprecedented times indeed that we're living in today, and the subject today is something we know that is very fundamental to many business leaders and executives such as yourselves. We will be talking about how to navigate the post-corona business environment. And we want to ask you to do a quick poll for us, which will be part of our intro as we will be discussing this subject. So if you could just take a few moments, Heba, if you'd be kind enough to put up the poll, and it should take you about a minute, and we would like to get those results soon. I feel like we should have some elevator music right now, right?
Oh, totally, exactly. There's even that 1 minute of a poll, you're going, okay, I hope everybody is listening. All right, I think we're pretty good. I'll let you back to that.
Okay, thank you so much for participating. To help us to do justice to this subject, we have with us the best in class of business academics who are well-respected experts in their respective fields. And I'll let them introduce themselves to you shortly so that you can get to know them a little bit better. Just a few notifications. We will be having a 40-minute panel discussion where we will debate this topic with the panel. All microphones will be muted at this time, and shortly after that we will have a 15-minute Q&A session to allow you, the audience, to pose your questions to the panel. So kindly prepare your questions in advance and type them out in the chat or the Q&A, and please mention your name because we would like to address you in person. I believe that this is being recorded, so details of that will be provided by Diane towards the end. So the results are in. Great to see that. Without further ado, I would like to now hand it over to our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. A warm welcome to you, professors. Thank you for joining us today. Please introduce yourselves to the audience and your respective field. And whilst you're at it, could you please reflect from your area of expertise on these poll results that we are seeing right now on our screen? Professor Yusaf Akbar, could we start with you?
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. So I'm Dr. Yusaf Akbar. I'm a British citizen based in Vienna in Austria, and I'm a professor of strategy at Hult. My areas of specialization are twofold. I kind of look at the role of digital platforms and business strategy, and the other area I'm focusing on quite a lot at the moment is how managers make decisions in tough to predict environments. Just looking at the result here, there seems to be a level of sort of cautious optimism and confidence in preparation on the way forward, which is interesting, and I think it could be a nice conversation for all of us here to find out from our attendees what they're doing exactly to be ready for the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Yusuf. Can we have Professor Ali Fenwick jump in after you?
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? My name is Dr. Ali Fenwick. I'm a professor of organizational behavior and innovation at Hult International Business School. I specialize in the behavioral foundations of organizations and management, specifically looking at how we can improve employee well-being, but also performance, especially in a digital workplace. I'm also the CEO and founder of a firm that specializes in behavioral economics. We develop behavioral solutions for both the private sector as well as for the public sector. Now, coming back to those results, I echo what Yusuf says, slightly optimistic. I think the results also reflect the nature of the business that these companies are in. So, I guess there's other industries out there that have a much more pessimistic perspective here. So what I find interesting from these results is, who's on the call today and what kind of business are they in? And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later.
Thank you, Professor Ali. Can we now move on to Professor Mark Esposito?
Yes, good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having us here. My name is Dr. Mark Esposito. So my area of work is mainly economics and strategy, but more in the macro side. My consulting or advising has been primarily with governments. I don't really have a lot of corporate experience since I started this job. And like Ali, I have also a firm. It's called Nexus Frontier Tech, and we specialize in artificial intelligence. So in the last few years, I started to go deeper into the interlinkage between business, technology, and policy. Regarding the polls that were displayed before, I see anyway that there is some readiness for our attendees to start engaging with the reconstruction, or at least to the design of the foundation that needs to be in place. And I think I'm happy that this webinar happens today because we plan it by bearing in mind that sense of recovery much more than simply just sharing how difficult this has been, which I think we all have experienced so far. And so thank you for having me.
Thank you for that reflection. Can we move now to Professor Nick, all the way from Amsterdam?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. My name is Dr. Nick Wake. I'm a professor of operations and supply chain management. As Diana said, I live in Amsterdam. I was actually born in Switzerland. I have dual British and Irish nationality. And I spend a lot of my time working in Dubai as a professor of operations and supply chain management. So I'm a bit of a global citizen, and it's interesting looking at your poll results from a global and operations perspective, because what I see is a big spread. And I think that spread is a result of the fact that different people work in different industries, and different industries have been affected in different ways in operations and supply chain terms. So there are some industries that have seen a big upturn in demand, and a big number of industries that have seen a downturn in demand. And as we progress through this seminar, I think it's interesting to have a look at the operational impact of these changes on organizations.
Thank you. And indeed, it is an international and diverse community with us today to discuss this very fundamental topic. Last but not least, Professor Alessandro.
Thank you, Ayanda. Good morning, everybody. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, which means that I work on two big areas. One is how do companies start? So we talk about startups, finding opportunities. But what I really focus on within this discipline is how do you make decisions under situations of radical uncertainty? And that's what makes it, my expertise especially relevant today, especially with a view to the long run. It's not about making a decision that works only next week or next quarter. So how do you prepare and cope with a very uncertain future? Now, I'm also a bit of a contrarian sometimes, and I like to look at these results following Nick, because I think that Nick pointed out very, very well. About half of the respondents do not have an optimistic view, and about half of them don't feel prepared for another wave of lockdowns. And my comments there would be, do you have an optimistic view about going back to normal or almost normal? And why should we go back to normal anyway? Okay, I want to provoke a few thoughts there and just to prepare a few comments that will come later. And the second question here is, how prepared are you for a second lockdown? Are you assuming that the second lockdown would be very similar to the first one, or will it be different again? So just I wanted to shake the waters a little bit to create a mindset for the future conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and I hope the audience will take that into consideration when they're posing their questions to you later on. So thank you for those insightful reflections, Professor. I think great food for thought and a good way to start us off on this conversation, how to navigate the post-corona business environment. As we know, the theme has been coming out of lockdown. It's a trending theme, and looking at the current scenario, Professor Mark Esposito, my first question is to you. So this crisis has seen the rise of the new status quo in terms of government intervention and government-centric decisions. How likely is it that governments will shift back to operate based on citizens' needs after this? Is it likely at all?
Thank you for your question, Ayanda, and I'm happy that we're starting with a conversation on the government. So again, I share a bit of what I have seen and a bit of what I also feel. The views are somehow very blended between the more technical or technocrat and the personal one. Clearly, government have empowered themselves at the rate we have never seen before. In many parts of the world, we have used language like state of alert that reminded us of a time where we were actually at war. And leaders really acted like we were at war with something. And so my worry with that specific behavior is that when a leader uses that language, he equally empowers himself or herself to have special powers. And we have seen governments rising at almost like nation states on steroids because many interventions happen really top down. I think I would hope that we were going to shift more into grassroots, more community-based solutions over time. The experience of the country that managed better were country that were able to understand like territorial economics much better than just national economics. I'm concerned that some country will simply find it addictive to raise up to a voice of enhanced status quo from a government perspective. So I think we have to be vigilant that this is only a crisis management moment in which governments are acting like you act in a crisis. It's not going to become a status quo of government acting with some form of authoritarian touch. Because in history, every time that we have erected barriers, it did not take a few months to bring them down. It took years. And so I will hope that we're going to see that as an opportunity. It's a reflection because I know many are connecting from different parts of the world, or they are from different parts of the world themselves. So just make sure that we're vigilant that this is becoming just a critical moment, not necessarily a new status quo, because that would be detrimental to what we want that new normal to look like.
Thank you for that, Professor Mark. Professor Yusaf, from a business perspective, we know that businesses operate within an ecosystem. How important is it for businesses to nurture the ecosystems and ensure their company's strategic resilience over the next couple of months, in fact, years to come?
Great question. Thank you very much, Ayanda. So I think now we're at 8, in some places 10 weeks now beyond the initial declaration of the pandemic. I think what's becoming clear in sort of conversations at board level and so on is that whereas I think the last 10 to 15 years has all been about global configuration, efficiency, priorities, and so forth, I think a realization that even if we as an entity have basically prepared ourselves for this kind of event, our partners within our ecosystem may not be as equally well prepared. And I think that moving forward, if you're at the center of an ecosystem of some kind, let's just take a hotel chain, for example. If you're Hilton Resorts or IHG, the question will be, even if I've managed to do all the things I'm expected to do to rebuild customer confidence, is everyone else in my ecosystem playing onto the same tune? And I think there's a real emphasis now on understanding partnerships in terms of resilience rather than efficiency, and looking at ways in which firms at the center of ecosystems can provide support. And we're talking very practical things like liquidity support, for example. We're looking at greater sharing of technology and advice. Treating your business partners more as partners rather than in the rhetorical sense of we are all partners. So I think that's the first thing we're beginning to see. And I think the second thing is that in the initial phase of the lockdown, it was all about value preservation. So it was like how do we ensure that the stuff we've already got doesn't become basically worthless, and how do we maintain that? Now I think that the more challenging step begins, where we as companies have to start thinking about how do we go back to the business of creating value in a different way from the ways we were doing it in the past. So again, industry by industry, executives will know what it is that gives them an advantage over their competitors. In a kind of a post-COVID-19 world, we may need to reassess what those sources of competitive advantage are. And that's an industry by industry question.
Thank you. And on the point of value, retaining value, we will delve more into that in a later stage. Turning now to you, Professor Ali, from an organizational behavior perspective, you've spoken a lot about the changing nature of work. Can you elaborate for us? How do you expect that to change going forward?
Well, I mean, even prior to, again, thank you for that question. Prior to COVID-19, we already saw that, the nature of work was already changing rapidly. The VUCA environment that we live in today, of course, but also the technology that we're seeing being implemented in organizations. Going forward, I think this change is only going to be accelerated. One specific thing from an organizational perspective, I believe, is that the working from home aspect is here to stay. I mean, prior to COVID-19, only 5% of workers in the US were working from home regularly. That number has gone up now to 24%, and that number will only increase in the future. This also has to do with the fact that people have gotten used to working from home, right? They don't have to commute. They see the efficiencies of working from home. And plus, they've also in this time, we're 2 months in this, but moving forward, we'll develop much more effective habits on how to deal with this working from home perspective. Just to give you one specific data point, and really a trend-setting data point, Twitter has recently announced that they're allowing their employees to work from home forever. Now, this is unprecedented. We love to use this word in the pandemic, right? But really, it's setting a new norm in terms of working from home and the nature of work. And other big tech companies that are able to do this are following suit. But we also need to be very conscious of the fact that many industries cannot work from home, right? So I guess in Europe, it's about 60% or 55%. In the US, it's 65%. In the Middle East and in Japan, it's 70% and higher. So this is purely due to the nature of their work. So cafes, restaurants, hospitals, factories, logistics, for that matter of fact. This is where you will see that retrofitting the organization and ensuring that people can go back to work in a safe manner is going to be a key thing. So you have this continuum from forever to never, where companies fall on purely on the basis of their capabilities, but also on the basis of their values and how they look at things. So I think things are definitely going to change, but one specific thing I just wanted to highlight today, at least to your question now, is around working from home and where I see the future going to on that basis.
Thank you for that. And definitely Twitter, I think, has opened up a Pandora's box with that announcement, and we'll see how the others follow, if there will be a domino effect. Professor Nick, turning to you, we've seen a lot of disruption within the supply chain. Can we expect some kind of return to normality within supply chain going forward?
I think what we're going to see is a new normal in supply chain management, actually. And I think that new normal is going to look quite different. I think one of the things looking at just to go back to the poll, is 53% of respondents said they felt quite prepared. I'd like to challenge that. And one of those challenges comes from the fact that some of the issues we're seeing now are not issues that are new. What we saw after the global financial crisis, for example, was that in some industries, demand went down 80%. And from a supply chain perspective, what organizations needed to do clearly was to respond to that. And, you know, the short-term difficult cuts were made. But what they then found was when they started to return to new normal, they tried to ramp up production. What they found was that there were really significant constraints because some of their suppliers had gone bankrupt. And I think what we're going to see in supply chain terms is we're starting to see disruption sort of cascading through the supply chain. So if we take aviation as an example, you know, the airline operators have been very substantially hit. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers being hit. So airline industry was hit in terms of operators. We're now seeing people who run airports being hit because demand has gone down. If you look at aviation, you know, people like Boeing are being very substantially hit because demand's gone down. And if you look at Boeing, it employs about 160,000 people directly in the US, but it employs about 1.5 million people in the supply chain. And the issue in the supply chain dynamics is that if those suppliers go bankrupt because they haven't got demand, actually being accredited as a supplier into that industry takes 18 months. So for them, as demand goes up again, if they haven't secured their supply chain, there'll be really, really substantial issues. I think the challenge from a supply chain perspective is twofold. First of all, to undertake really, really robust risk planning to ensure that your supply chain is robust and to ensure that you secure supply for the long term.
Thank you. And I think, Professor Alessandro, listening to Professor Nick, there are business models which have been greatly impacted by the COVID-19, and some, obviously, listening to or looking at the poll results, some businesses have not been greatly impacted as they've been well prepared, which is good. But for those who have been greatly impacted by COVID-19, what do they need to change when we're speaking about business of innovation?
Yes, thank you, Ayanda. I completely agree. So everybody's been affected. Almost everybody's been affected. Some benefited from it. Some definitely suffered. What I'd like to suggest is, it's a sort of a test, a set of reflections that you need to ask. I'm not going to give advice to random individuals what to do, but what to look for, what to consider. So I think that unlike other crises, this crisis was driven initially by a change in regulation, which affected the business model of many industries. And that then reflected changes in consumer behavior. And then that affected the presence of a demand, as Nick was saying, as Yusaf said earlier. And so what I think you should do as a business, these are the first three questions you should ask for the short and the long run. So has my business been affected by change in regulation? So think about real estate or cars. You can't really go out, you can't visit apartments, or you can't rent them, you can't sell them. That business has shut down. But as soon as the lockdown eases, probably the demand will pick up again. But then that leads us to the second question. Has the behavior of our customers changed? And how will it change in the future? I'm thinking about our industry, of course. Will students be willing to come to class? Will students be willing to sit in a room with 100 other students from 70 different nationalities? Will professors want to go to class? Now, I started seeing on social media colleagues saying, well, you know what? I was never hired to teach online. I definitely don't want to be at risk. So let's think about something else. Mm-hmm. So what's the nature of the behavioral response? Okay, some people will be desperate to go out and start living the way they used to. And so if that's your business, then see how can you take advantage of that while keeping them safe. Others will want to meet the same needs in a new way. And so how do you go in that direction in the long run? And the third one definitely has to do with, is there still any demand? And I think that's where my colleagues were headed. Think about if you are a manufacturer of digital devices, of processors, or you're based in Asia, and now suddenly demand has gone down. The nature of logistics will change even more. Transportation will no longer be efficient. So in a way, you may no longer have a demand. And then the question is, can you reposition yourself to create value in a new way? Then there's another big element I think every industry, every company needs to consider, and that's the element that has to do with how asset heavy are you? How invested are you in big, huge assets? Now, we can look at this at different levels. Let's think about real estate. If you have many buildings, how do you create value out of those buildings? And I think that there are at least two huge ways. So you can have real estate in terms of providing services that achieve proximity. You get close to your customers. So you can be, a restaurant down the street or a hair salon. And so you're close to your customer, and that can still create some sort of advantage, assuming that your customers will want to come back, okay? But think about those who, like us, like universities, we have huge real estate and we use it to create efficiencies, meaning that we bring all of the students in one room so we can teach to them efficiently. Now, I think that kind of efficiency, that kind of assets will have to be repurposed. And the way we organize our education will be based on the physical location of the students now being online. So we will not organize courses based off one campus, but based on out of one geography where our students are. And so that will change the way we manage our business. So what are the takeaways? Look at the impact of regulation. How did that impacted your customer demand and behavior, and demand in the long run, and reconsider your assets.
Thank you, Professor. I'm actually glad that you're now jumping straight into, what can we do? What can businesses do to be more proactive to, as we look towards recovery? And I think now as we, start this journey, what can you advise from your perspectives? And starting again with you, Professor Mark, we've seen, millions of people have been really devastated and hugely affected financially and marginalized by what has been happening with the crisis. From your perspective, what can financial institutions and services operate, or who operate in the financial sector, how can they support in future to close this ever-increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots? Because it seems to be widening with this crisis.
That's right. Thanks for your question, Yanda. So clearly, I guess that the gap has become wider. It was already quite large before, and I think this crisis simply has been exacerbating even more, right? The gap between those who have, those who don't really have. One idea that I'd like to share is that more and more fintech will probably rise to the challenge, because you have to bear in mind that one of the problems we have in the financial services is that we either have unbanked people, and that's one kind of story where the M-Pesa model in Kenya comes up with a great way to say, by using mobile banking, we address the unbanked. And in the developed economy, we used to have a lot of underbanked people. I guess the level of underbanked people now will increase even more, because banks will hardly be able to meet the needs that people will have, especially after the reconfiguration. No matter whether it's a reconfiguration from a demand side, a reconfiguration from a logistics side, or a reconsideration from new behavior that will change the way they want to think about work. Whatever it is, whatever my four colleagues before, and to some extent created a perimeter reference. So I think fintech will actually try to close that gap more and more. And we start seeing example of fintech solutions that try to really go and understanding the new needs and trying to deliver financial solution for that. So I just, as a very, really conclusive thought on that, just look into the fintech solution, try to understand how this is going outside of just the bubble that was in London and now becoming much more distributed. And also try to determine how the concept of money will eventually be different, concept of capital will be different, when you're redesigning some of this condition. So this would be actually my suggestion, to look deeper into the fintech solution to try to close the gap between the underbanked and the needs that we have now reshuffled through this crisis.
I think, and that's a great, advice, Professor. And we're seeing that even aid is being pulled out in some of these countries because of this crisis. So I think that's a very, very astute reflection on your side. Thank you for that. Professor Yusaf, what strategic actions should organizations take now to preserve existing value, which you spoke about earlier on, and begin to generate new value towards the end of 2020 and starting off 2021? Muted. Please unmute.
Sorry. Thank you again for the question. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to shore up our liquidity positions to make sure that we have enough cash. I mean, that of course is problematic for smaller firms versus larger firms, but all companies should be looking at the country level for particular opportunities to get support from governments to ensure that things are fine. I think if we're a larger company, I think we need to be prepared to look out for our suppliers who may not be in such a strong position, but as Nick has suggested earlier, are vital to ensuring consistency of value delivery to customers. So I think on the back end, if you like, that's the first thing that they should do. And I think if you look at the front end, the customer facing end, I think is to significantly reevaluate the sources of customer centricity and value that we offer. And have a deep dive into asking customers what is it that they want from us in this seemingly different environment that we face. And and just listening to my colleagues as we were going around here, my sense is that when all of this is done and dusted, the impact of the pandemic, while of course by definition having a global impact, will have quite substantially different impacts industry by industry. So I think what tends to happen, and I think this is perfectly normal because psychologically we focus on single data points to illustrate more broader arguments. I mean, clearly some industries are going to be massively hit. Nick has already spoken about aviation. I mean, it's a disaster. I'm doing work right now on looking at the impact on hospitality, and it's just a mess. But there are other sectors, which I think will bounce back more effectively. Manufacturing in China is getting close to what it was before the pandemic, and so on. So make sure that your liquidity position is secured. Help out your suppliers, and go back to the drawing board and asking your customers what it is that they actually want in this kind of post-COVID-19 world. What are the new sources of value from a customer centricity perspective?
Thank you for that. And I definitely think, especially also in the retail sector, that's something that needs to be considered, looking at the impact there, considering that brick and mortar is slowly fading away. Thank you, Professor Yusaf. Professor Ali, what can organizations do on their side to be more prepared for this new emerging realities related to the nature of work?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ayanda. I think in terms of preparedness, I like to use the analogy that when you are in mid-flight and you have an engine problem, you can't fix the engine problem mid-flight. You have to wait till you get down to the ground, you land on the ground safely, you let your passengers out, and then you investigate and see what worked well, what went wrong, what can be improved. So how are our operations? How did that work? How does our business model look like? Which business models were sustainable, which not? How were our management responses, vis-a-vis that worked and what didn't work? So I think in that sense, preparedness, we can start thinking about preparedness, though I don't think all of us are out of this crisis. So I think we have to wait also as well to think of how do we get out of this crisis? And then also how to then think about what are the next steps and what are these new emerging kind of realities that we have to prepare for. Now, one thing that I think is being said a lot in the organizational perspective is resilience, right? But what does resilience really mean? I mean, I think this is a buzzword that's used too easily, right? Because, for example, if you look at what resilience means in finance, it's more about having, the financial slack. If you look at operations, it's more about having both the capacity and the capabilities. But if you're looking at workforce, it's more about flexibility and developing a more resilient human resource base that is able to deal with these realities. Because in the end, it's the people that make these changes. So I think in that perspective, if I could give it some kind of scope, I would say that preparedness and resilience falls along the line of 3 pillars. One, it will be around innovation. 2 will be around agility. And the third thing will be around, I guess, responsiveness. And I think these 3 pillars are going to be very important in terms of thinking about how to better prepare yourself for the future. One thing that this pandemic has shown us is that, I guess when it comes to culture and understanding organizational-wise talent, it's eaten and it's had, strategy for breakfast. So in that sense, I think we need to think along those pillars, those low-hanging things that we can do and how we can then prepare for the future. So that would be, I guess, my advice in terms of being much more prepared for realities that we do not know what's going to come.
Thank you for that, Professor Ali. I just want to remind the audience that if you could please, type out your questions in the Q&A and we will address them. Professor Alessandro, there is a question that I think you would be able to answer. And while doing so, could you just also, elaborate on this concept of strategic foresight and how this can help organizations better prepare for the future?
Strategic foresight means preparing for multiple futures. Why do you have to prepare for multiple futures? Because you can't predict any specific future. We are often taken by surprise because we didn't know what was going to happen, how severe it was going to be, when would it happen. In fact, I just want to recommend, if you want to know more about preparedness for a pandemic, there is a special issue of the Harvard Business Review who discusses this at some length. It was published in May 2006. So this is how long we've been discussing and preparing for what to do in case of a pandemic of different severity. And yet, I would say, I for one was not prepared. And I think that most of the clients and students I know were ill prepared. Why is that? Because we can't know. And so how do you prepare? You prepare by contemplating multiple contingencies and having, as Dr. Ali was saying, a range of responsiveness and flexibility and agility and extra resources that let you prepare. There is a great example that I really want to share, if that's all right, about there is this Canadian professor, he's Mexican really, but Professor Aspuro Guzik. He runs a self-driving lab of experimental chemistry out of the University of Toronto, and then there is a number of startups related to this. So what he's doing is he's automating the development of new materials using AI and robots. So the lab itself runs on its own and can constantly learn at the speed of machine with the supervision of and expertise of humans. This is the type of digital transformation that pushes us through the future, but also for the common good. So not only is doing this, for example, to create more efficient materials for solar energy, which is definitely a direction we want the future to go to. He's also now pivoting the same solution to find better vaccines and better molecules to fight the pandemic. So what he's doing is leveraging digital technologies to become more flexible, more responsive, and combine the unique abilities of machines and humans to make the world a better place. I think if you put these things together, this is what I really wish every one of us could be doing more.
Thank you for that, Professor Alessandro. And I would like to just give the final words to Professor Nick. What can operations managers do going forward? 1 or 2 points from you, and we'll jump straight into the Q&A after that.
And I unmute my microphone. I think go back to Ali's idea of flying an aeroplane. I think it's as a cognitive shortcut, it's easy to think that landing an aircraft is the opposite of taking it off, and actually that's not true. And it's not true in operations terms either. I mean, I think there's been some very significant issues with cutting because demand for a lot of products and services have gone down. But preparing for the new normal isn't just the opposite of that, which is ramping up. And the reason for that is because there's a difference between capacity and capability. The capacity you can cut, so if you have a reduction in demand, you can reduce your headcount. But to be able to increase your capacity at the end of the pandemic, what you need to do is to ensure that you have retained your organizational capabilities. And these capabilities are the things that allow you to produce your products and services. And these are complex bundles of intangible and tangible resources. So the lessons from the global financial crisis are twofold. First of all, you need to identify and protect your critical resources. What are the things that make the difference? What are the things that create value for our customers? So that's number one. And number two, you need to ensure that in terms of managing the upturn, you need to expect supply constraints for the reasons I've already discussed, which is that there will be constraints because of the the knock-on impact in terms of tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And so what you need to do in operations terms is to respond to that. And I think some of the response will be things like new technology. I think because of the industry 4.0, which I know Mark knows a lot more about than I do, what we're seeing is disruption in industry, so that this requirement for massive scale economy to produce things efficiently is being disrupted because industry 4.0 allows us to produce products and services in much smaller batches. So I think the new normal will be a response to that, and that response will provide additional operational flexibility, and that additional operational flexibility is a key to success for organizations in the long term.
Thank you so much, Professor Nick. Thank you, professors, for that very insightful discussion. And I think without further ado, let's jump into the questions. As you've answered part of them, we have from Mr. Izwan Adnan, who's in the oil and gas industry. And his question is that post-COVID-19, despite the recession we are facing now, contraction of more than 50% on all sectors, there's a big boom of digital service-based sector. And on top of that, countries will try to relocate resources to increase domestication of the economic supply chain, for example, the food security. Do you think it's finally that government policies should focus on SMEs that focus on these technologies? We should focus both economic of scope, which is large, a function of innovation. In my observation, these firms are nimble and have the appetite to explore or risk in trying new technologies or methods, despite having an unproven track record. I think this is good on the short and long run for economics. What are your thoughts, Professor Yusaf? Do you have anything to say on that?
It's my turn to take with the microphone. I think the evidence suggests that your hit rate with giving SMEs the leadership in technology development is pretty low. So you need to have a very large number of SMEs doing this. This tends to happen in fairly kind of distinctive environments, clustering effects and so on. I think another thing is we frequently confuse firms with growth ambitions with small businesses. Many small businesses are not that interested in growing. So for me, the challenge is not so much, a shortage of new ideas. The issue is the scalability of those ideas. And generally speaking, we know that, large organizations are much better at scaling. So governments can certainly help SMEs perhaps with kind of capital expenditure and sort of underwriting some of the risk. But ultimately, any idea that comes out of an SME has to essentially be scaled up by a larger company. I mean, the simplest example, of course, is the race for a vaccine. It's one thing to develop a vaccine for this novel respiratory virus. It's another thing to actually be able to deliver it to 8 billion people on planet Earth. And I think that's where large companies come in. I mean, the US government's been heavily criticized for its treatment, preferential treatment of large businesses over small businesses. But I think ultimately it is the large companies that are the bedrock of the economy.
Thank you for that insight, Professor Yusaf. I hope, Mr. Adnan, that was a good answer for you. Professor Ali, there's one. Sorry, Diana.
Can I ask you, sorry about that. I'd like to ask one question on behalf of all the business councils, good, because we are a group of 11 that were here supporting you. And this is just a very basic question, and and then obviously let you back to your Q&A. But what we're looking at is, how can the business councils help in this time? What would be the proper, I mean, you see the small SMEs, you see the larger companies, we obviously deal with both. So this might be a question that a lot of the business councils, that's why we're here, obviously, to redirect information to our members and friends.
Great question, thank you. Who wants to tackle that?
Professor Mark? Yeah, I can share something with you, Diana. So back in 2015, I was working on a report for the World Economic Forum on something called collaborative innovation. What we noticed is that sometimes when large companies and small companies work together with a clear and actually explicit agreement that they will not lead to merger and acquisitions, some form of, let's say, innovation can come from the smaller companies, and some form of scaling will come from the large company. So we have seen a number of really interesting co-joined or co-licensed or co-patented experiments in which the innovation from the startup was being scaled through the channels of the large companies. And I think this is a time where we don't want to suffocate the small and medium enterprises, because inevitably, if we don't do something about that, their liquidity problem will become a liquidity trap. So we want to make sure that the large companies can help. Large company, they used to spend significant amount of resources on research and development. But when you tap on the ingenuity of startup, much of that innovation tends to come from them. So rather than going into this very predatory M&A mindset, in many cases fails because of the relapses. It's much easier to work on collaborative innovation model. So if you're interested in this, you find it on that report, you can find it on the website of the World Economic Forum. It was called Collaborative Innovation. And it was really a way that we studied the number of case studies in which, for example, you would have a company with 4 employees now joining in collaborative innovation format, a company of 15,000 employees, right? And that was working pretty well. So I think this is the time where that kind of collaborative innovation framework can really help to make sure that we are preserving some of the value of this organization. Clearly, their value proposition in the market will change because the market has changed. But I think one thing is to see them go, and the other thing is to help them recover towards some form of value proposition.
Thank you so much. That was really well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mark. And I remember a masterclass on that subject, collaborative innovation. It's really, truly insightful and definitely something that businesses should look into. We have 2 more questions, time enough for 2 more questions. And the one was for you, Professor Ali Fenwick. It says, it's from Lisa from ABCD. Lisa asks, Dr. Fenwick mentioned the never to forever continuum of working from home. What are his thoughts on working from home and flexibility being new buzzwords for trimming down operational costs? And how will this impact organizational culture and subsequently reputation?
Jana, thank you. And Lisa, thank you for your question as well. No, valid points. But I would like to mention that, the working from home perspective and having a flexible workforce is all being part of being resilient, being able to manage your workforce in a much more flexible manner. And yes, I mean, it's not just only cutting costs in that sense, but it's also for the perspective of having that flexibility in there. So operational cost cutting, it is a given. I mean, I think another perspective of working from home and flexibility, what we're also now seeing, for example, in Silicon Valley, where a lot of the people that live in San Francisco, now people are working from home. I mean, I think this opens up a pool of talent, doesn't it? You can now get the best talent from anywhere around the world. So in both ways, this means if you're competing now against someone who lives in Wisconsin or who lives in Romania, you can pay them much more, you can pay them less for the same or even, the better expertise that they can provide than someone that can do that back home. So there is some challenges around the working from home perspective. But again, from an organizational perspective, I think there is cost cutting in there, but there's also other benefits that can be achieved with that. I'm hearing her. So Lisa, I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you from a employee perspective here. And yes, at the same time, there's also a fear from the employees about what's going to happen to my job if someone else can do that. So there's that perspective in it as well. But I just want to mention one last thing to Lisa, and then also to the general public here, is that one thing I think organizations will have to do or will do in the future. I think the purpose of the office will change. In that sense, I mean, now we have so much more people working from home. I think now working from the office will have to compete with working from home. So, you're seeing a lot of organizations now becoming, or at least in the hotel industry, they're moving more into becoming more well-being purposed. So maybe the repurposing of the office to become more well-being orientated can be another way of attracting and retaining talent in that sense. So I think that lots more is going to happen just beyond the operational cost saving. And I think we're going to have to look much more of what is the purpose of office working from home and a flexible workforce.
Thank you for that, Professor Ali. Professor Nick, you spoke a lot at the beginning about your time in Dubai, teaching in Dubai. I know that you're not an economist, but can you just tackle this question from Farhin Asfi about how you see the UAE dealing with its economy compared to other countries, maybe the Netherlands, where you are, and what do you think will happen next to the economy here in the UAE? Maybe Professor Mark can chip in where necessary.
Yeah, I think that the UAE is in for a rough ride, to be honest. If you look at where the economic activity is in the UAE, I mean, the construction industry is very big. The leisure industry is very big, the aviation industry is very big, and shipping is very big. And those are all industries that have been substantially affected. So I think from an economic perspective, things will be quite difficult. I think the challenge, therefore, in terms of response is a response that needs to be coordinated by government. I think that there's a real requirement for government and industry to work together, because I think the economy will be disproportionately badly affected compared to the rest of the world, particularly because of the collapse in oil prices. And I think as a government and industry partnership, there needs to be an appropriate response drawn up that says, if we see our economy contracting, what is the impact, not just on companies, but individuals that work for companies, and how do we respond to that in a way that ensures long-term value and not just short-term cost saving.
Thank you so much for that. Professor Mark, you wanted to add something quickly?
Well, I agree with Dr. Nick, absolutely. I think, though, just to be fair, the issues of the UAE did not necessarily become visible now. They were already a problem that the UAE was facing before the pandemic, because of the fact that their original business model was exhausting. There was less aggregate demand. The number of people leaving the expat going and competing in other locations, it was equally increasing. And I think there is a limitation to everything. It was a phase of growth. I think it got to a point of consolidation, but also saturation. And it was already in the conversation. I was part of a project with the Prime Minister's office. And this conversation about diversifying the UAE economy has been around for quite some time. So I guess I see the pandemic as being a shock therapy. Clearly, everybody understanding something has changed, but also an accelerant to make sure that that specific conversation is now moving into some form of proposition, because the conversation was still a bit not defined. Now I think this will define it more and more. Just to bear in mind that the Emirate of Dubai had a debt over 100% of its GDP, right? So clearly, when you see those situations, it shows you that it's time for you to migrate your business model elsewhere. And I see this maybe shrinking first, but reshuffling, a little bit like happened in Singapore in 2008. At first they shrank, and then eventually they relocate into different clusters. So I would hope this is the way in which the government can go.
Thank you, and that's a very good note to end on. Thank you to all of you, our esteemed experts, for your time and for those great insights. Thank you to our lovely audience joining us today. We hope that you found those insights practical and very helpful to help you to move towards the recovery. Thank you to Diana and the Canadian Business Council for giving us the opportunity to speak with you today. If you'd like to connect with us, please do so via LinkedIn. All the professors are available via LinkedIn and myself. And we hope to interact with you and connect on any other subject that is impacting you and your organization going forward. Over to you, Diana.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I can't believe the amount of value we're getting from the information today, the all different points of view. And please, thank you so much that letting us all connect through LinkedIn is going to be very, very important to all our guests and members here today. I wanted, obviously, special thanks to all our speakers today, our panelists. Taking time out and giving back is so important in all times, since particularly in this time. It was very informative, but it was also, I want to say, user-friendly, for a lack of a better term. Thank you. You made us all feel quite involved into this conversation. Thank you very much to all our other business councils, because they're working together, that's what we do. And basically, I want you all to stay safe, and I hope to have you guys back. We're going to put that offer out to the universe right now, so please come back, because we do want to hear from you very soon when we're on any updates. Take good care of yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao, bye-bye.
Bye.
Grazie.